Welcome back to the Jaco Report. In this week's shooting of a St. Louis police officer in broad daylight near an intersection jammed with men, women, and children is just the latest example of the strain of violence running through life in many of St. Louis's neighborhoods. Why do you have often this disregard for human life? Why the violence? Why, in a tiny minority of people, this culture of death in some of our area's poorest communities? Joining us now to talk about this, Alderman Antonio D. He represents the city's 21st Ward, which includes some very troubled neighborhoods in the North Side's Fairgrounds Park area. Alderman, welcome to the show.
Hey, Joseph.
When we got together last week, there was a vigil for victims of violence up on Lee Avenue in your ward. And you told me an interesting story about the guy who was wanted as the suspect of this that kind of indicated the endless cycle of violence that starts very early in some of these families where their kids end up getting in trouble.
Right. The suspect in that case, which involved the tragic murder of a 50-year-old woman just walking down the street, she's a mother of 5. The suspect was about 19 years old, 19, 20. He came from a family that had his older brothers were in jail. They had been suspected in some very violent cases in the community. And so this young kid, probably from a young age, saw his brothers going down that path of violence, saw violence in his community, in his household, and unfortunately, started leading a life to mirror that. Unfortunately, that is a case for a lot of young people in the community who start seeing violence at a young age, and it becomes normal for them. But the thing I really want to emphasize, though, about the vigil that you and I met at last week was that the best thing that came out of that was that in the wake of violent action and a tragedy, the community came together, and as a lot of people came out that day to prove that there are more good folks in the community who want to live in a peaceful neighborhood where they are free to let their kids walk up and down the street than those folks who want to cause trouble and make everybody else's lives miserable.
Which brings us to the shooting of the police officer. If you got people, I mean, this case up on Lee Avenue, for example, the gunman shot down this woman because she was being used as a human shield, and he just kind of went through her to get at his intended target. Earlier this week, an officer shot numerous times in that tiny minority of knuckleheads and thugs who were essentially imprisoning all the good, honest people in their homes. It seems that they've become more dangerous and better armed in recent years, in that in previous years they might have thought twice about displaying a gun to a police officer, let alone opening fire. Now there's no such thing. What's going on there?
Well, any police officer will tell you that that's true. Out on the streets, it has become a much more dangerous place. These perpetrators, who are now younger and younger, are better armed than many of our police officers, and they don't have that regard for life that used to exist, even in criminals back in the day, and that's a problem. And so what we have to do is make sure that our officers have the best equipment that they possibly have when they're patrolling these neighborhoods. As often as possible, we try to make sure that they aren't patrolling alone, which is often the case. I think it was the case in this recent shooting. And so it also becomes important, because these criminals are so young and because they don't have that same kind of regard, that older folks who live in the community, we encourage to, at a younger age, start engaging with the young people in our community, start learning the young people's names, trying to become a part of their lives, because they may come from households that don't have father figures, don't have positive influences in their households.
Back the way it used to be in the old days, where if you did something wrong, your parents might not bust you, but the woman living 2 blocks down would know your parents, see you up to something, and tell on you.
Exactly.
When it comes to this kind of violence, though, and people in the communities being held hostage by it, I think the one question that keeps coming up again and again is, if you've got young kids in these neighborhoods who've seen their first dead body at the age of 6, 7, 8, 9, if you've got some of these kids who have a lot of violence in their home and there's ready access to firearms around there and not a lot of economic opportunity, I think the amazing thing is that not more of these kids don't go off the tracks.
Well, most of the kids want to get out of that environment by any means necessary, and we try to give as many alternatives as possible to that. The pathway through a better education system, obviously, is the best one. Then after that, better job placement. But for that small group of population, that small population who are who abide by this get rich or die trying mentality, for them, we offer them love and understanding, but also swift enforcement of the law. And so, part of what we're trying to do is give police in our community better tools, which will include the surveillance camera project we're doing in 21st Ward, to be able to catch some of these guys. Because often what happens is it's the same small group of people who are plaguing the entire neighborhood.
Talk to me about that surveillance camera regime that's going to go into effect in your ward. We've seen this in the so-called Ring of Steel in downtown London. We've seen parts of it in central Manhattan. Now it's going to be coming to your ward. How's this going to work?
Well, it's not quite as elaborate as some of those other systems, but what we are starting with, hopefully, is about 12 cameras within the next year around the area, around the ward in high crime areas that we know a lot of activity is occurring, like that Natural Bridge Strip, like where the officer was shot the other day, like Lee, where the woman was shot last week. This camera system hopefully will do two things. One, by people knowing that these areas are under surveillance, it will be less likely that they will come to this area to commit their crimes. What we know is that there's some areas in the city and in the region where people know that they can't commit crimes or shouldn't commit crimes, certain kinds of crimes, because they will likely get caught. And then there are some areas where they feel comfortable doing it because people in that area are less likely to report them, less likely to cooperate with the police. So what we hope to do is, by these cameras being there, people will be less likely to commit their crimes there. But if the crime does occur there, hopefully these cameras will provide the evidence that we aren't getting from people cooperating with police.
Do we have as many cops as we need?
No, we don't. We don't have as many cops as we need, and we don't have enough money to pay for as many cops as we need.
Because I was going to ask that. You've got two-man patrol cars have gone away. It's generally one-man patrol cars. That's what happened with this officer. The video surveillance camera he had in his dashboard was provided by a private group, the Police Foundation, because the city doesn't have any money.
Right.
It seems to me, even with this federal stimulus money kicking in 50 or 60 extra officers in the city, at some point, if this keeps up, one is going to have to consider what you do in adding a lot of manpower to the police force to try to patrol these areas.
Well,
true?
Everybody wants more police on the street, and frankly, the taxpayers chipped in a few years ago by passing a sales tax increase to send more money to the police department to pay for additional cops. Unfortunately, the state-controlled police board decided to pay for pay increases instead of more cops. But that's a whole nother story, I guess. But yeah, we do need additional security. One of the things that we're looking for in my ward is looking at creating a community improvement district along Natural Bridge, which will create more sales tax revenue that can specifically go for additional security on that strip.
Final question for you. When you go to some of these neighborhoods and you talk to some of these troubled kids, I mean, you're not, you're a good deal younger than me, and you're not a great deal older than them in the grand scheme of things. What do you see in them, and what do you tell them sometimes if you're concerned about them getting that calloused attitude where no life, including their own, is very important? Yeah,
and again, that's a small minority of folks who are feeling that way. But following some of the violence of a few weeks ago, myself and State Representative Jamila Nasheed started some conversations with some of the guys that you're referring to, some of the guys who are gang affiliated. And we had some off-the-record conversations with them. And what we found in talking to them is that they care about our community too. A lot of them, be there 19, 20, 18, they have kids themselves. They don't want to live in fear that something could happen to their kids just being outside, just walking down the street or playing. And so, they got together and started in our ward a program called Operation Unity, where they are coming together to kind of claim the neighborhood again, doing community service projects. So we can't write off an entire generation. We got to continue to communicate and to collaborate with folks of that generation, because frankly, the people who we are talking about, that small minority of people who are causing the big trouble, will listen to them more than they will us. So if we can get them talking to them, I think that's going to help.
Alderman Antonio French, thanks for coming in. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.
When we return, Memorial Day and our newest generation of combat veterans, the Jaco Report, we'll be right back.